Good morning. Welcome, welcome. It's good to see everyone on the final day of the PDE conference. I heard the movie was phenomenal last night, so for those of you who were able to enjoy it, I hope it was equally positive for each one of you. My name is Jennifer Collins, and I'm here to introduce our speaker for today. To my left is Dr. Virginia Berninger. Dr. Berninger received her PhD in psychology at Johns Hopkins University and has a career informed by both translation science, which is bridging research, basic research and application to practice, and interdisciplinary contributions to assessment, diagnosis, and treatment, including instruction. As a professor at the University of Washington, Dr. Berninger has been the principal investigator of research grants on typical and disabled language learning, funded by the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, and also the co-investigator of a research grant on math development and instruction, funded by the U.S. Department of Education. This interdisciplinary research has been informed by Dr. Berninger's prior teaching experience in urban, suburban, and rural settings in general and special education, and at the elementary and secondary levels, training in clinical psychology and experience as a licensed psychologist in the assessment of developmental learning disabilities, and ongoing consultation with schools, teachers, and parents for more than 30 years. Her current efforts focus on evidence-based treatment-relevant differential diagnosis of specific learning disabilities and professional development for teachers and for other professionals in schools and outside schools who influence school practices. I mentioned to Dr. Berninger, I've been following her work for 18 years. It was through Dr. George McCloskey at PCOM who introduced her work to those of us who were in his session at the time, and she has personally made such a difference in my personal and professional career. So I want to really proudly introduce Dr. Virginia Berninger.
Thank you. I'm going to talk today about the other three-tier model: screen intervene, problem-solving consultation, and instructionally relevant differential diagnosis of specific learning disabilities. I've been talking and writing and doing research on this for about 25 years. Now that I am retired after a 50-year career, I am focused on trying to share this with the people who work in the real schools at the local level, because frankly, they are the only ones who are going to be able to change things so that children are better served. And I will try to make my case. I'm going to emphasize that it takes a team. This presentation is dedicated to the memory of Ed Shapiro. He was a leader in the state of Pennsylvania. He was a dear colleague of mine in training school psychologists and so on. I also want to thank Monica McHale Small, who was instrumental in inviting me to come. And we have just learned to know each other about 2 years ago and found out we had a lot in common. We have played different roles in school systems and appreciate how we need to get all the parts working together more effectively. Now, I'm going to talk to you about an interdisciplinary perspective. This is grounded in my own experience. I first started teaching 50 years ago. It was during the other revolutions, the first civil rights revolution. And I decided it made more sense to go into schools and help the kids than to protest in the streets. It was also the Vietnam era, and they had a program that you could teach in inner city Philadelphia and get a deferment and not have to go to Vietnam. But they did open it to women as well as men. So my first teaching experience, I had 50 third graders, 25 were African American from the projects, third generation. This was before free and reduced lunch. It was real poverty. 25 were Puerto Rican, 25 of the children were Puerto Rican. And my vivid memory is when Martin Luther King was assassinated and we were called down to the assembly, and I sat there as a white woman explaining to these children why everyone was so upset. I survived the year and became more committed to teaching all children, regardless of racial, cultural, socioeconomic background. My colleagues who had signed up for this program to avoid going to Vietnam decided to sign up and go to Vietnam. It couldn't be worse than what they were confronting with real poverty. There were gang wars, kids were getting sick, dying. We had police escorts to the bus. Now, in some ways, I think we've come a long way. But that's how I started. I was also in inner city Pittsburgh, suburban Pittsburgh, and Frederick, Maryland, when we did the pilots for special ed, before the law was passed in 1975. And while there, we demonstrated that you can help more kids more effectively to provide differentiated instruction in the general ed program. This is called inclusion. And if it's done correctly, it works. And I have seen schools demonstrate this. We've shown it in our own research. And that's my big message. Don't tell me we can't help these kids because we don't have the money. It doesn't take more money. It takes doing what we're doing more smartly and in a caring way to serve all the kids out there. We call it FAPE for all. So I spent 9 years teaching. I was in general ed, special ed, reading specialist. And then I finally knew what I wanted to do. I had started out as a psychologist, and I got a PhD at Johns Hopkins in psychology. It was very interdisciplinary: psychobiology, cognitive psychology, developmental social cognition, and psycholinguistics. I was recruited by Mel Levine at the end of that program to come to Children's Hospital in Boston, where, among other things, I worked most of my time in clinics, birth to young adulthood, on interdisciplinary teams, 23 disciplines, when we used to have UAFs in honor of the Kennedys in 48 states. Became a licensed clinical psychologist specializing in developmental and learning disabilities. Was then recruited for the University of Washington to help them develop their school psychology program around a scientist-practitioner model. Trained school psychologists for well over 25 years, and also headed up NIH research grants. So I was doing a lot of teaching, research, and dissemination through service, locally, nationally, and internationally. So I bring an interdisciplinary framework to what I'm doing, and have recently, with an advisory board of about 40, written a book that APA Books has published called Interdisciplinary Frameworks for Schools. Now, having worked on medical school faculties and hospitals for 6 years, everyone complained the DSM is just not relevant to developmental and learning problems. It was designed for medical settings and primarily a way to bill insurance companies. So we designed this book, which is has been given to Division 16 of the School Psychologists in the American Psychological Association to start what might be a guiding manual for school practitioners. It has 2 websites to which you can continue to make contributions to share with practitioners. It also has access to a lot of research-based resources. It is very interdisciplinary, and that's what the parents originally wanted when 94-142 was passed, interdisciplinary teamwork. So, I just want to mention some of the people, or show you their pictures, who have been very helpful. What I'm going to present today in no way reflects just my ideas. I have learned over the years from so many, and this is just a small sampling. NIH does provide funding, but what many people don't realize is the project officers work very closely with the researchers and really help educate and guide us and support us. And these are some of the ones that have been very, very helpful to me. The colleagues on the team to do interdisciplinary research, just like to put what's learned from research into practice, takes a team with many disciplines represented. And it has been mentors elsewhere in the field. And I want to start with the lower right, Robert Colligan. He just died this year. He was at the Mayo Clinic, part of their groundbreaking epidemiological studies. They're considered the best, was funded by NIH. Clear evidence during the school years, 1 in 5 children, that's 20% of our school-age population, has one or more learning disability, with or without ADHD. Now, I will be mentioning that with appropriate intervention, kids can get better. So they may change in how and if they express these problems at a behavioral level. They are treatable, but that's a sizable number. And you do the arithmetic. Can we afford to pull out 20% of the kids out of general ed and serve them? I don't mean to imply that special education would go away. What we are proposing is a pull-in model where the special ed teacher is actually involved in teaching and collaboration in partnership with classroom teachers and others on the interdisciplinary team, making it much more feasible to serve more of these kids who may have reading disabilities, writing disabilities, math disabilities, and oral language disabilities. The most under-identified and served learning disability. Because whoever wrote the special ed laws and categories says if you have an oral language problem, you have to be served under communication disorders instead of learning disabilities. Seems like some of those laws may have been written by people who aren't grounded in the interdisciplinary foundational knowledge of what learning disabilities are, how they express, and how to effectively teach them. I want to also call your attention to the upper left-hand corner, Victoria and Dennis Malfeast. They did the first groundbreaking brain research showing that you can identify brain differences very early on in children who then maybe don't show the behavioral signs of learning problems till age 4 or age 8 or even later, because there is a genetic basis. Below him is Dick Vineski. The late Dick Vinesky was the first to show how English speech is represented in spelled words, and to call attention and to demonstrate that English is a morphophonemic orthography. And if you don't remember anything else I say today, English draws on morphology, phonology, and orthography. And I'm going to be defining those words later on. And the only effective way to teach any students is to cover all of those. So if you've been told all you need to do is phonological awareness and phonological decoding instruction, and research says this, that isn't true. That's false information. In today's society, I guess we call it alternative facts. And I want to introduce you to what research is really showing. Multiple investigators across laboratories and countries. And finally, the upper right, Malt Josie, who's been a leader in NATO-sponsored literacy projects around the world. He started the first journal international to publish writing research. We still have a long way to go, so people understand. Not all learning disabilities are reading disabilities. Not all reading disabilities are the same. Oh my, you mean not every child whose parent or teacher thinks they have dyslexia does? No, you need comprehensive evidence-based differential diagnosis to identify the nature of reading disabilities, and I will return to this. But it was Malt Josie at an American Educational Research Association meeting many years ago who asked me to do an edited book on orthography. And I said, I can't do that because everybody in the field is so phonocentric. They don't care about orthography, even though there's lots of research evidence. He said, you're going to do it. That turned into 2 volumes, and it is still going on an e-book with the profits going to fund African education. The research, and we just had yet another paper published, it's online now, Journal of Learning Disabilities. Do you know what accounts for more variance in reading and writing achievement? Orthography. Who would have thought the ability to process letters in written words would have anything to do with reading and spelling? But so do sounds and morphology. I want to disclose a conflict of interest. When we were doing all this research, Aurelio Prefetera, who was head of Psych then, asked if I would work with them to translate our research into assessment and intervention products. I was reluctant, but he's a very persuasive guy. And at that time, there was virtually nothing in writing. Thank God, there's now so many other resources out there. And I also want to mention Marshall Raskin, who is a leader in learning disabilities and technology, who has arranged with the University of Washington for distribution of the computerized lessons we've developed in our research over the last 5 years to help teachers with differentiated instruction. But unlike the prevailing model, if you just buy this product and use it, the kids are going to get better, and it's research based. It's only going to be available with arrangements for professional development and consultation with local schools, because our goal is to help educators have deeper understanding. We don't think technology alone is going to do it, but it could be a tool for modeling some of the approaches. Whenever I transition topics, I'm going to show you a picture of two fairies crossing, one in one direction, one in the other. I spent 30 years of my life looking at this, and you kind of wondered, do we know where we're going, which direction? But this is just signaling that we are changing topics. Now, I'm going to feature today, in the spirit, it's going to take multiple professionals in schools, in research, contributing to solve these problems. I want to feature the work first. It's going to be Nikki Wolf-Nielsen, and she's over on the right with some information about her. She's the author of The Tills. I'm going to feature the work of Bev Wolf, who's been a teacher leader in the structured multisensory approach to helping kids with dyslexia, and Elaine Silliman, who's been a leader in ASHA. Notice these people come from different disciplines, and I'm a psychologist, but it's going to take multiple kinds of expertise. And also Lee Swanson, he's been editor of the Journal of Learning Disabilities. He's been internationally recognized for his work in working memory and its role in learning disabilities, both in children for whom English is and is not the first language. Now, I have listed 7 objectives that I hope I can share some information with. Language is one of the 5 domains of development, and each of these is relevant to literacy acquisition. And I apologize if I'm stepping on toes. It's very common to say, well, the solution for dyslexia is multisensory training. You show me how anybody can learn to read if they're only using the sensory systems of the brain. It just doesn't work. You have to use language tied to each sensory and motor system. Language by ear, eye, each motor system, mouth and hand. Language, it's multi-leveled, and it's tied into cognition. We need intellectually engaging activities for the kids to engage in. And attention and executive functions. We have to be able to have mental self-government for all this complexity. And social emotional. And I'm going to really emphasize that as I go. Everywhere from, we've been interviewing kids. Oh, I learned the year the teacher gets kids and connects with me personally. There's this emotional part. We even have the brain evidence now. The kids with learning disabilities, but not the typical language learners, they're activating, you don't see it, it's inside the head, their amygdala, which is involved in emotion processing. This is just about to publish with the Journal of Psychoeducational Assessment. We have to be concerned about the whole child, for whom a specific learning disability is just one part of their developmental profile. They also have their other strengths. Okay, language is not a homogeneous construct. Please don't say language, reading, and writing. Really. Reading and writing are language too. And we do have language by ear, eye, mouth, and hand. They're separate systems in the brain, but in learning to become literate, they get coordinated. Each language system has multiple levels: subword, word, syntax, multiple words, and text. Now, listen up. Learning literacy builds on informal conversational register, like during early childhood. Then you come to school, And there's a different register of language. This doesn't get talked about a lot, but Elaine Silliman, along with Cheryl Scott and some others, are leaders in getting people to realize this. Teacher talk is very different than how we use language. You can have kids who are really chatty, and you think, oh, language is a strength. But they're not, and we've published this too and shown, they're not paying attention to teacher talk, and they're not processing it. And there will be a symposium on this at the Triple SR meeting in Halifax in July. Underlying language learning is, Chomsky was right. There's a language learning system. But the architecture has multiple components. He identified syntax. It turns out, and I will be showing you pictures and in words explaining what those components of working memory are, and they're very relevant to identifying and treating learning disabilities. Now, Garrison Keillor says part of wisdom is learning to hold two contradictory ideas in mind and not going crazy. And I'm going to tell you something that might sound contradictory. With screen intervene models, you can prevent most of the learning disabilities if they're implemented in an evidence-based way. That said, because of how the genetics affects the early neural wiring and which kicks in at different stages of neuromaturation, there are some persistent learning disabilities that are they have to be monitored and dealt with, or there will be struggles throughout development. And I'm going to try to clarify that. So it's important that we both screen, intervene, try to prevent, but to continue to monitor and be cognizant that even with one's best efforts, some kids are going to need not just accommodations, but specialized instruction in middle school, high school, and the cutting edge now is college, post-secondary education. Okay, finally, what my goal is to help you understand the concepts. There are multiple assessment tools or instructional resources you can use according to what you have available. If you understand the constructs, and so you're pulling on the multiple tools. And I don't know if this will be surprising to you, but some people who like to cook would realize most recipes have multiple ingredients. And how good you are at combining those multiple ingredients affects the ratings you get for how good your cuisine is. Learning and teaching is no different. And I'm afraid that the message researchers have sent to educators is that there's one thing that works. You just teach this one thing that works, and they're all going to learn to read. Forget about writing and math. I mean, they're focused on that single variable. Well, learning, no more than food, depends on a single variable. We've got to learn to live with multiple variables. You wouldn't get very far in algebra if you couldn't deal with multiple variables. So those are the big points. Nikki Nelson helped me prepare these slides. I have so much respect for her. She has been working on this for years. She was one of the first to realize these kids have writing problems, but she had an IES grant from the Institute of Educational Science. She put years into this, developing the TILs so that you can, from the very early childhood years up through adolescence, assess these multiple aspects of language. And I'm just going to show you some of the key innovative ideas in this. It goes from ages 6 to 18, 11. And bless her heart, she's made it available through Paul H. Brooks. They had an exhibit here with some of these materials. So even classroom teachers, special educators, other members of the team can learn to assess language. So this is just a form that comes with it called the Student Language Scale. And one of the things I love about it, you don't just test the child, you consider the teacher, the parent, and the student input. Who would have thought? Parents have something relevant to share, teachers, the student learner. There's more to be learned about learning than just from test scores. That's part of it. We want some test scores, but we need all these perspectives. So she has two scales or kinds of items that have to do with sound and word reading. And she has also looked at the degree to which you get the same information from teachers and parents. It's more than half the time, it's converging. But sometimes you get unique information by listening to the different perspectives. And then she has two scales that have to do with the written composite. And again, she gets the perspective from teachers, parents, and students. And it's not like 100%. It's worth getting the multiple perspectives. Now, the other unique thing, she's introduced new psychometric properties of sensitivity and specificity. Is it sensitive? Is it picking up the problems? But is it specific to specific kinds of problems? So I really encourage you to get a copy of the TILs, and she is available, and there are trainings available to help people learn to use these instruments. And one of the things I'm going to really emphasize, if you really want to identify why a child is having struggles in learning literacy, you absolutely need to know, and this is research-based, multiple studies. Did the problems first emerge in the preschool years and early childhood, or did they only become evident around kindergarten and first grade when you're trying to teach formal literacy instruction? We need to know about the language development along the way. And so this is just some more information showing there is evidence that this is helpful. Now, I'm sure people in this audience have heard of Slingerland. And usually when people say Slingerland, they think about, arms in the air to learn handwriting. That was just one technique early on with kindergartners to get them to pay attention. What most people forget is Beth Slingerland's book that made such an impact was about specific language learning disabilities. She understood it was about language. And I get lots of questions about, are there controlled research studies supporting multisensory? I don't know of any for multisensory alone. Are there research studies supporting the Slingerland method where you embed the multisensory, and we prefer to think of it as multimodal because you're also naming letters and writing, motor system. Embedding that in structured language instruction at different levels. I'm very happy to announce there now is published in the International Journal of Reading and Writing, which is a well-established journal now. It was done by Bev Wolf. She recruited, she had control groups, and it was longitudinal. She found that the structured language embedded with some multisensory handwriting instruction in first grade was more effective than business as usual. More importantly, she looked at whether we should introduce cursive in second grade or another year of manuscript. And it turned out it was more beneficial to have another year of manuscript because we first have to learn to make legible, accurate letters, and then we have to get automatic. Now, that said, one of our doctoral students, who's now completed the program, did a study, and in our longitudinal study, he found from third, fourth grade on, up through middle school, which is as far as the longitudinal study went, there was a benefit for cursive. Better for spelling, better for rate of composing. When you think about it, the connecting strokes help link letters into word units. My point is, what works, what's effective, may depend on grade level, developmental stepping stones. That's what's been missing with what works. We need to know, literacy is a journey. At each step along the journey, what are the most important skills and what are the most important ways to teach them, to develop them? And these are just some examples about how the handwriting is embedded in the language instruction. And these are some other things you might want to read to get some deeper knowledge of what Slingerland is contributing. Now, bear with me. One important difference is that unlike informal conversation characterized by frequent turn-taking and short stretches of talk, academic register involves one talker, teacher or presenter, and long stretches of talk, which can be challenging for sustaining heard language in working memory. That is one reason current educational practice advocates for punctuating instructional talk with conversations among classmates. So that helps them get more engaged when they can do their own talking instead of just sitting there and listening. And I have had more college students who have overcome their learning disabilities talk to me in private and say, nobody sees, this is still invisible. I still have trouble sitting in lectures and I'm listening and comprehending, and then I lose it. And then I've lost track and I have to zero in. That's the lifelong problem, and it has to do with working memory, sustaining attention to language, not attention in general, paying attention to ongoing language input. It can be very hard even after they learn to read words or spell words. If you want to learn more about academic register, these are some things I recommend that you read. Most of what I've brought is some resources to help you keep learning. These are some resources about academic register specific to the word level. And I think another message that has been unfortunate that's come out of research is you've got to decode words. And how do we assess it? With non-words. And so some people have this idea that vocabulary doesn't matter to learning to read. Quite the contrary. Vocabulary and semantics are also important because, let's face it, most of our reading and writing involves real words. And from a brain and a language development perspective, word meaning really does matter. The work at the University of Pittsburgh by Isabel Beck and her colleague who continues it, and I'm unfortunately blocking on her name, but they have some, text talk, and they have wonderful instructional materials for vocabulary development, and these are some things you can read for deeper knowledge on the role of vocabulary. And this is something they have been university professors have been complaining about for at least 50 years. When I was taking courses at Temple University, teaching in the Philadelphia schools during the day and going to Temple at the night in summer, they just moaned and bemoaned that content area teachers are not teaching the vocabulary specific to their domain, the math vocabulary. Let's read and spell these words, or you're not going to know what the questions are for these word problems. Science-specific vocabulary, social studies-specific vocabulary. And when you do that, it really helps. So I'm going to try to follow my own advice, and I'm going to define what I'm talking about with the multi-component working memory model for language learning. We have 3 storage mechanisms in our brains, minds, for storing heard words, spoken words, one for read words, written words. So the first one is called the phonological word form storage. It's for storage and processing. There's sounds involved, okay? So it can involve the unit smaller than a whole word up to a whole word. We have a similar one called orthographic word form coding for storage and processing for letters in written words and that we read and ones that we write. And there's been research around the world, and there's 3 things that are important, whether it's phonological or orthographic: sound or letter identity, sound or letter position in the word, and sequence. It's called phonotactics and orthotactics. And you may hear all that matters is phonological awareness, but what research is really showing is this ability to abstract statistical patterns about which sounds or letters can occur at the beginning or the end or the middle of words, position, the identity of the letters or sounds, and their sequencing is very critical to reading and spelling acquisition. And you can do things like playing anagrams with the kids to help develop this. Phonemes are important for alphabetic principle, but as Becky Treeman's work, and she's done a lot of this, there's also these rhyme units, R-I-M-E. Syllables, when you have polysyllabic words, the syllables have an onset phoneme and then what remains in the syllable. And in English, it's a myth that English is hopelessly irregular. Only if you don't know how it works. Because it turns out there's 23 of these rhymes, word families, 2 to 4 letters, but the rhyme unit is very predictable, and teachers have known for over 50 years. They call them word families. And some of the researchers are finally catching on. So you have different units of sounds that have to be connected with letters. So on the one hand, you have to get things stored in your working memory, but you also have to interrelate them, and that's where morphology comes into play. By adding fixes affixes to the beginning or ending of words, we can transform them. The prefixes transform meaning, but the inflectional suffixes transform tense and number, and the derivational suffixes transform part of speech. And both spoken and written words have morphology. So it's the bridge for helping to integrate the words we hear and say, the words we read and write, so they can work together. Now, to help us do this, working memory has a phonological loop that allows us to coordinate what's stored about sound for words in our memory with what we say through our mouth. How much we're learning to name things. Preschool years, naming objects in the world. Go to school, naming letters, naming words. Well, turns out the RAN, heard of the RAN? That is very related to phonological loop. That is, it's assessing phonological loop. Ability in that case, you've written letters or letter groups, you hold them in memory, and then you name them. And timing matters for efficiency. We also have the orthographic loop. You hear words, or you know how to spell them, it's stored in your memory, but you write it through your hand. You write the letters, you write the words. Notice phonological loop, mouth, orthographic loop, hand, motor. It's multimotor. It's not just multisensory. But to coordinate all this, you need government. And this has been well documented in the research, that on the one hand, you need to focus your attention. And a man named Stroop came up with this color word test. The Dallas Kaplan has a subtest you can measure inhibition. You read color words that are written in one color of ink, and you're supposed to name the color of the ink, not the color of the word. So you have to attend to what's relevant and ignore what's irrelevant. That is very relevant to helping organize this complex language learning mechanism. And another one is RAS, switching attention. It alternates letters, numbers, letters, numbers. You're switching back and forth. That one, both of these, Dallas Kaplan inhibition, and on the Wolf and Dankla, I think it's available now through Donald Hamill's publishing company. It's switching attention. It doesn't take too long to measure those. And the RAN, of course, is also on the Wolf and Dankla. So these are all part of the language learning mechanism. And there's also sustaining attention. And Rick Wagner encouraged us to, with our RAN and RAS, to also get values for time for each row. So you're looking at sustaining, not just the total time. Turns out that also contributes uniquely. And it fits in with this report of many affected individuals. They have trouble sustaining attention when they have to listen to stretches of teacher talk. So those seem to be the main components. And we discovered that in connection with collaboration with Lee Swanson, and also a very large family genetic study with over 1,700 individuals. And we gave these clinical measures, and then the geneticists linked them to genetic basis. Okay, so Elaine Silliman, both listening comprehension and reading comprehension require storing and processing multi-word constructions often in clauses, but not always. A lot of our language is idioms. In working memory over time and accessing cognitions, not only at the word level, but also at the sentence and text levels, and inferences that may involve social cognition. These are more resources to read more deeply. And when I talk about problem-solving consultation and inviting yourself into a classroom to observe the child paying attention to oral language instruction, these are some of the things you want to look at. Child may not be causing any behavior problems, but if someone gets in there with an extra pair of eyes and looks, they're not paying one bit of attention to anything the teacher is teaching. And if they don't act out and misbehave, they may not get noticed. Okay, academic register writing requires production of letters and written words that are sequenced typically in clauses over time to express cognitions. Not only are multiple levels of language involved, but also access to the cognitive domain, vocabulary meaning for word spelling, and thought world for sentences and text, and sensitivity to other audience in mind, the social emotional domain. So here, lots of those domains of the brain system for development are going to be involved with academic register. And Lee Swanson has been studying working memory for well over 40 years. He just got a huge grant from the National Science Foundation. He also does a lot of work with the math and working memory in ELL populations. But he approached us and we started collaborating on a longitudinal study of typical language development, or cross-sectional maybe. And I was startled. I found out that those word forms, the word coding for storage and processing, are very critical the first 3 grades. And starting about 4th grade, that's when the syntax level for sentences and multiple sentences really kicks in. Now, some of you may have heard of all this research coming out about the late emerging reading comprehension problems. These kids seem to be doing fine, and then all of a sudden, about grade 4, if you really look closely, they're not comprehending. Well, it's because, and there's a group in England, and there's been in our country, Hollis, Scarborough, and UCATS. It's this working memory problem and syntax problem. So the point is, we can't just screen and intervene in 1st grade and think all the problems are solved. We need to keep monitoring, because literacy learning is a long journey. And I've already explained these coding loops and supervisory attention functions, but the point I want to make here is we need a profile to look at all of these. And kids will differ in their patterns of relative strengths and weaknesses. How many of you have heard about that? So yes, we need to look for these patterns of relative strengths and weaknesses. Now, this is the same thing summarized in a visual. 3 word coding forms in those blue circles: phonological, orthographic, morphological. We have to interrelate them: phonology, orthography, phonology, morphology, orthography, morphology, and all 3. And the loops coming out the mouth and the hand. Then as words accumulate, the affixes and parts of speech and function content words, they allow us to organize words into syntax, also the word-specific order of a language. And then our panel of executive functions at the top, which also includes self-monitoring. Did you know one of the major causes of math disabilities are kids who don't self-monitor? They can demonstrate knowledge of the skills, but when they're in the process of doing a calculation or problem solving, they're not monitoring, and they may get one step wrong, and then the answer's wrong. It's turning out to be a problem in paying attention to steps in a process or placement of numbers on a page. So these executive functions can really affect academic learning. Now, I didn't bring much brain research with me, but I just want to assure you, in numerous studies, we find that the brain represents that phonological coding, orthographic coding, and morphology coding in different places. And even more importantly, we've shown if you really want to normalize the brain, you have to provide instruction, not just on phonology, but also orthography and morphology and how they interrelate. And we actually, Paul H. Brooks asked for some of those lessons, and we published them in a book in 2009, showing how you can do that. And we did another study where we compared the connectivity of the brain, and we compared kids who did not and did have training in phonological and orthographic loop, how you coordinate these out your mouth, out your hand. And we got normalization and connectivity only if we included those naming and those writing activities to make the connections. There is a lot of work, and you can read this on your own, showing brain differences in children who do and do not have learning disabilities in their supervisory attention. And the most current work we're doing, which is, there's a whole new approach to brain research. It's called the Human Connectome because it's so complex from molecular up to systems. And I'm more and more convinced that what's really going on in learning disabilities is a severe malfunction of some of these executive functions for coordinating all the processes. So these are just some more things if you want to read and get deeper knowledge of some of the work on working memory. Now, at this point, because the timing is such, if you have questions, may I encourage you to write them down on a piece of paper. And if you provide your email address, and please make it real legible, if we don't have a chance to answer these questions today, I am glad to correspond with you and respond to your email address and answer to the best of my knowledge the questions, whether they be about clarity or just questions you might have. So at this point, I'm going to transition to an overview of the other three-tier model, but if anything that's come up so far is a question for you. Oh, okay. Now, I'm sure you know about the most common three-tier model. And it was well-intended because there was a time where children had to fail to get a discrepancy of a certain size in order to qualify for special ed. And typically, and this was well documented, that wasn't until about grade 4. So they had to wait to fail long enough. So this wasn't good. So we started the three-tier model. The problem is that because of this focus on a single variable, the sense it's only phonological awareness and only phonological coding, what has played out in practice is this tendency, the tier 1 tends to be pretty standard, the same thing for everybody. And then if they don't respond, you give them more and more intensely. And then if they still don't respond, you refer them for special ed assessment and placement. Now, this didn't jive with what we were finding in research. We went into multiple schools, multiple school systems, and we would screen for all the low achievers in word reading or all the low achievers in handwriting and related writing skills. And we would do interventions. And there are different skills other than just phonology that were relevant. But with intervention, for those who had any of the multiple indicators of risk, and the intervention addressed what was impaired while teaching to all levels of language, we could get all these kids who had been at the bottom to at least average and sometimes higher in 24 lessons, suggesting that maybe we need to screen and know what is wrong, do some interventions around that, and then they will become more responsive to intervention. We did a similar thing in second grade for word spelling and multisyllabic word reading, and by third grade we worked on the composition and comprehension and so on. And this approach of finding out where weaknesses may be, and they may not be in the same place for every child, we found we could prevent. We did some large controlled studies and partnerships from schools serving low-income, diverse populations. And what we kept hearing from all these schools, when they do this, they just hardly have anybody to refer to special ed. And so, really, we do believe most of this can be prevented, but with one caveat. Third to fourth grade is a major developmental transition, particularly in writing. The nature of assignments and the amount of writing increases exponentially, and moreover, starting in fourth grade, you're not going to succeed if you can't integrate reading, writing about what you've read, listening, taking notes, writing about what you hear, the cross-integration of language. So it's still important to screen grades 4 and 5 to make sure these skills are coming along so they're ready to go to middle school. Okay, now, a lot of what I've learned, it's not like I think around thinking this stuff up, but my whole career, I've spent a lot of time in schools, even when I was at the university teaching and supervising interns. And I started looking around, and there's so many stories that aren't getting told of the amazingly wonderful things going on in schools. And I just saw example after example of problem-solving consultation being put in place with amazingly good results. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So there are, at any grade level, problems can arise. They're often related to things going on outside of school, in the home, or sometimes interpersonal relationships in the classroom with peers or the teacher. Health problems that emerge with the kids, and so on. So deal with those as they arise. And it really has nothing to do with special ed. And, there's a whole lot of material out there now about effective problem-solving consultation. But that said, specific learning disabilities are real. And sometimes they persist. They're not all the same, and so we do need some differential diagnosis. Because what's wrong has application to how to fix it. And I'm going to be talking about the kids who have what we call oral and written language learning disability, ALD, and they kept getting referred to us not responding to intervention, so they're doing more phonics. Well, lo and behold, these kids had language problems involving morphology and syntax. You know what their strength is? They respond to phonics often and decoding. They have trouble with real words. They have trouble with the word finding, the morphology, the syntax. So we started providing instruction related to what was wrong in those oral language skills. And all of a sudden, they made amazing progress. And there were a number, I think someone was trying to tell us something, and the same thing with the dysgraphia. And so we do think there is room for Tier 3. And in medicine, part of what they're trying to do is to figure out what's wrong, because you can have a temperature, but there's a zillion reasons why you might have a fever. We have to puzzle out what is going wrong with this individual, because that may speak to what appropriate specialized instruction is. So, if you're interested in learning more about this than I can possibly cover today, the UW Extension worked with us in the last year of our most recent funding cycle. We developed a 5-part online course for professional development. You can take it from any state in the U.S. They actually work with some foreign countries too. And they will make arrangements to get CE credits. But it's a new approach in online learning for professionals at work. They call it asynchronous. You don't just go to something like this and spend 2 hours and go home. It's online. You can have multiple people from the same professional community participate as you can fit it in. And there's actually activities to go back and work with your own professional community, try to put it into practice, and then have conversations online with colleagues elsewhere. This is all supported by online technology. And there's 5 major units. One is supporting success for every student and all the research basis for this. It's geared to be used with the APA book, Interdisciplinary Frameworks for Schools. Unit 2 focuses on K to 3. Unit 3, 4 to 6. Unit 4 is grades 7 to 9. And then there's a unit on diversity, which there's quite a bit on technology use in schools and diversity throughout all of this. And we piloted it, and now it's being offered for real starting March. You have to enroll by March 27th. And so if you have any interest in this, we did this at a time when the S Act had just passed. I don't know what its fate is, but I still think it's in everybody's best interest if we still try to optimize the achievement of all students, whether it's required in the law or not. And that's a big theme in the interdisciplinary frameworks. The laws are there to protect rights if best professional practices are not put in place. They're not our guidelines for everyday practice. There is absolutely nothing in federal or state law that prevents us from proactively doing best professional practices and preventing these problems and optimizing achievement. And that's where the confusion has been. We've looked to laws written by people who are not trained in the scientific foundations and scientist practitioner foundations for education to prescribe practices for everyday work in the schools where they don't have the training for that. And we need to turn to our own professional best practices. In medicine, law, and clinical psychology, that is the model. But for some reason, that has not been emphasized enough in education when you're working in a school setting. And then we need to sing the praises of people. We need more of the success stories told and shared so that it comes from within the educational profession, that we can really help a lot of kids. So, transition to Tier 1. Well, in kindergarten, now I want to emphasize, I see some really crazy stuff out there, including start training them if they're at risk for dyslexia in the womb or shortly after birth. These people have not had any training in brain development or genetics. The way genetics works, it kicks in at certain stages of neuromaturation. So as best we can tell, and there's a number of papers out there now about the genetic bases for the kids with the oral language problems that emerge in the preschool versus dyslexia or dysgraphia that would be more like K1, and it's more specific to written language. Those risk factors tend to kick in at various times in development, and some not until middle childhood or adolescence. So then it's an interaction between what's happening in the classroom and what the vulnerability is at that time. The key thing is to know what you should expect at certain ages as kids are developing. And in kindergarten, it turns out that the really important skills are letter naming and letter writing. And these are things that are really easy to ask kids to do. You randomly show them on a 3x5 card each of the lowercase letters. There's more lowercase, and they're more frequent in written material, and it's better to focus on them first. Name the letters, see if they can write them from memory, not just copy them, and see if they can write the alphabet. And when we first started out, by the end of kindergarten, just about every kid could write A to Z. And then they stopped teaching handwriting because of Common Core, or not as much or the same way. Common Core was not written by people with scientific knowledge of reading, writing, and oral language and how they interrelate. It was written by policymakers and government folks, and I know they mean well, but these are the things they should be able to do. These are just some resources. I think Zaner Bloser. There's plenty of resources, and all you need to do is work on writing the letters, how you form them, and name them. And not just copy them if they hear the name, because it turns out the name of the letter is very critical to accessing them. And yes, they do need to know about sound awareness, but syllables, this is well established. Syllable segmentation comes in first. Rhyming words, the end of monosyllabic word, then syllables, and then beginning phonemes, okay? And there are sound games and looking games that you actually really don't have to buy anything. The sound games came from Rosner, and we published it, I think, in the Journal of School Psych. It's 24 lessons, and it works too good because I've used it as a contact control. It's really easy to do. And there's like 4 different activities, and it can easily be done in kindergarten. And then there's looking games for kids looking at letters and words. And this was all based on research. And the interventions are things you can do. They don't take a lot of time, and you really don't need to buy things. The math screen. Now, people don't think about this, but there's a huge writing component to math, and we have found a lot of the kids who appear to have math disabilities, it's all related to writing, the numerals. And so you need to work on not just teaching letter handwriting, but the numerals. And it doesn't take that much. Just add on some numbered arrow cues and show them how to form numerals. And they need to get automatic. And then, and this is, we've known this for years. There was seminal work by Robert Ziegler, Carnegie Mellon, oral counting forwards. This oral counting. And things in the classroom. You just have kids count a lot. This ability, you get this idea of numbers organized in counting order along a number line. And these are some approaches for developing that. And if you don't know about Ginsberg, at Columbia Teachers College, the Big Math for Little Kids, you can get information on his website. I have seen it modeled. It is absolutely awesome. And he's gone into inner city New York. And it is just the most clever thing. He spent his whole career working on early math development cross-culturally. So those two things go a long way in a kindergarten classroom. And these are just some more practical suggestions. Don't just put alphabet or number models up at the top of the class, in the front of the classroom. They need concrete visuals at their desk. And just masking tape with numerals and having them count. It's a multi-sensory motor approach. And then writing the numerals. That helps a lot. And then for each of the other grade levels, we talk about which sound skills to assess, and then how you can go into intervention. And all of our research-based interventions had multiple components, and we drew on multiple resources already out there. And then for writing, there's a few key writing skills and plenty of interventions, and likewise with math. So these are things, they're covered in that online course, and you can read on your own. Unless there's questions, I'm not going to go into this. Then likewise, in second grade, you move up to the next developmental stepping stone, and this is where word-specific spelling becomes very important, where you integrate orthography, phonology, morphology, and word meaning. And likewise for writing. All of our lessons, they might work on handwriting and spelling, but they're also composing. And this is just all based on the research that was geared to these grade levels. And once you get up to grades 4 to 6, I just have the same screen, and you can use it in that developmental frame where you're just seeing, have they gotten all these things together for the orthographic coding, the morphological, and the phonological, and also sentence structure. Now, another piece of this, most of our reading comprehension, and this has been documented in research, involves text-level comprehension where you can draw on world knowledge, not just language. A lot of kids' problems don't show up unless you have sentence-level comprehension that's sensitive just to language and making words fit syntactic context. If it's about true and false statements about information in the world, it's tapping into cognitive world knowledge. So we're not picking up a lot of problems kids have at the sentence level. And we need to, when we assess writing, also look at sentence combining, not just text writing, but text writing across different genre. Okay, for math, I want to emphasize grades 4 to 6. The underlying problem we're not assessing for remediating, it's the part-whole relationship. We know we have a problem in our country where kids aren't learning fractions and they're not doing well enough in algebra. There is solid research in developmental science. The underlying problem is part-whole relationships, and there's so many fun things you can do with concrete aids to get across part-whole relationships. We actually did this in Saturday clubs, and it's just amazing the progress they can make. Now, please do write any questions you have about Tier 1. And I don't have time to go into all the details how you would implement that. There are lots of examples of that in the interdisciplinary frameworks. This is what I don't think we do enough of. Reaching out annually to parents. Let's not wait till they get attorneys and come to us. They're often anxious because the problem runs in their family. Maybe they were in special ed. When parents come in really upset, first thing I always ask, was there anybody in your family growing up who had struggles at school? It's often the parent or a brother or their sister. They know it or their parent. It runs in their family. So you need to allay their concerns that we've come a long way. We can help their kids. Or they're angry because they see their child coming home frustrated, can't do the homework, and so on. But if you reach out and listen and show you care, it goes a long way. Schools I have visited have parent rooms. They're more and more common, where you invite parents to come in. They can come in with younger children. They can seek out the counselor, the school site, ask questions, or in the upper grades, get strategies for helping their child with homework. You're building a relationship with them. And when they feel you care, they're not so anxious and angry. And it can make a big difference. Members of the team who aren't general ed teachers should invite themselves in to the classroom to observe, and not just looking at the behavior of the kids, but how are they paying attention to instruction. And we've come up with family questionnaires that we've used in our research that we share, but you may want to develop your own tools for the populations you work with. Some of the tools that we put in the guide to use with the PAL 2, which is in a CD in the test kit, is when a teacher refers a child, you have a teacher interview and you really listen to the teacher. What are his or her concerns about the child? I had a former student who, when she went back after completing her PhD, initiated consultation where if a teacher referred a child, she would set up a time. She would go into the classroom and actually try to teach the child. She was a former teacher, to sort of feel what it's feeling like from the teacher's point of view. And she'd have the child in with other children to get a sense of how that kid learns and behaves when there's other kids in the group. And that got her a lot of respect. You follow up with the teacher interview. We provide some matrices for identifying tests that you might give, or branching diagnosis. You don't have to give every test. Listen to what the parent and teacher are telling you their concerns are. Observe, and then just figure out the tests to deal with those hypotheses. And then you know the steps of problem-solving consultation. You plan and you implement some modification of what you're doing, and then part of that is a plan to evaluate, is it working? And if it is, fine, celebrate. If it's not, reevaluate and try another approach. But the first line of attack isn't to put them in special ed. Okay, so these are some things I widely observed. Weekly team meetings before or after school. Everybody in the school is welcome. teachers can bring up any child they have concerns about or the parent has brought concerns to the school. And people go through the steps of problem-solving consultation. And I have seen that ward off so many problems. And one of the things we do in the frameworks is to honor teachers who are on there, or other members of a school district who've done some amazing things. And one of them is Jim Van Veltzer. I used to send interns to him. He was in such popular demand in his district. This is what he did. It was brilliant. When he first heard a kindergartner or first grader was just not behaving well in the classroom and causing trouble, he implemented early intervention for learning how to behave at school. But he drew on his family counseling background. He involved the child, the teacher, and the parent. Somebody from the family had to be involved. And he came up with a little plan that everybody had to agree to and sign into. And you know what he found? Whether kids had learning struggles or not, 99% of the problems involved relationships. We found that in our writing samples. The kids were writing about their problems getting along with people in the home and with the teacher and classmates. Relationships. So he worked on relationships, the social, emotional. Do you know why he was in so much demand? These kids learned how to behave at school. The behavior problems went away. They had no referrals to special ed. It's an amazing thing. I've learned so much from him. Others have implemented drop-in consultation, like they designate a day of week before school when teachers are setting up their classrooms. Teacher can just drop in, spur of the moment, to the school psychologist's office and get informal consultation on a concern or a problem. And sometimes you need a procedure in place for requesting that kind of consultation. And something we don't do enough of is preparing the classroom teacher, providing help for preparing for those parent-teacher conferences that occur maybe once or twice a year and can make a big difference in working with parents. Another school psychologist started a drop-in time during recess where any kid who had a concern at home or in school had a problem could come and drop in. There'd be other kids there. There'd be games. He'd talk. He built relationships and was very effective in making connections. I talked about questionnaires. You can follow them up with phone conferences and in-person meetings. And you need to be able to broadly deal with behavioral and academic concerns. And as they get older, there's issues, with homework and transitioning program. Often community resources, all kinds of examples in the book, from parental addiction, dealing with divorces and step families is huge. And while it's not appropriate for the school to provide direct services, there's often some free or reduced cost services available in the community you certainly can make parents aware of, and we have found that to be very effective. So, if you have any questions about Tier 2, you can write it down. Now, I'm aware that Tier 3 is very controversial. I know some people are trying to solve these issues through lawsuits. I don't think that's the solution. What some of the confusion is, and listen to the language, specific learning disabilities. These occur in children who are otherwise typically developing. There are so many children with developmental disabilities, other neurogenetic or neurological disorders. If you want a great book on this topic, it's by Batshaw et al. He's from Georgetown Medical. There are so many of these they're low incidence, but many of them. Yes, they're going to have trouble with academic learning and other problems, but those are not specific learning disabilities. And a lot of the problems schools get in, they're trying to use what research says works, which was really, well, I'll tell you another little secret. Actually, did you know the National Reading Panel was all based on typically developing readers? They didn't cover writing, and they really didn't cover learning disabilities. But that said, you need to access solid information for teaching academic skills to kids with developmental disabilities. And they can learn, but at their instructional level, whatever that may be, and it's often way outside of age level. But that said, there's still 1 in 5 with the specific learning disabilities. But we do provide in the frameworks information on ruling out developmental disabilities. And then, of course, if you find them, you want to help those kids, you need IEPs for them too. For identifying the SLDs, you need a learning profile, the academic skills in reading and writing, math and oral language, and a working memory phenotype profile. These are measures that research has well documented are related to underlying genetic and brain bases because there is a biological basis. However, learning disabilities occur across all SES, racial, and cultural groups. And it was a major mistake to have in the law that if there's evidence of English language learning or low SES and all those other things, then it can't be a learning disability. That is just false and it doesn't fit the research. You just need to know these are other issues. And this is a visual of the 5 domains of development. You can see language by eye, ear, mouth, and hand with the sensory and motor systems. I know we throw around the word kinesthetic. The somatic sense has actually multiple sensory things from touch, pressure, pain. But when we use the word kinesthetic, it has a very specific meaning, sensing movement. It's kind of sensory motor integration. Okay, each of those language systems has the multiple levels, sub-word, word, syntax, text. But do you see the heart? Turns out the way brain's organized, you can't get up to the cognitive part without going through the limbic emotional system. There's so many ties between our emotions and our social interactions and cognition. And of course, now the hottest thing is theory of mind. And it's relevant not only to autism, but teaching kids to write, understanding the perspective of other. It's relevant to participation in a democracy, being able to have a debate where you consider different perspectives in developing bipartisan. The big lesson from the brain for democracy is it takes the right and left for the brain to function. And you need communication between the right and the left. It can't just be one perspective. And then we also have up here, which I'll show you, is the cognition. Need intellectual engagement. But what's common across all the SLDs are problems in lower level executive functions. Supervisory attention. Inhibition, so you can focus attention, switching attention, self-monitoring, sustaining attention. Now, what has come out of research, if you have dysgraphia, impaired handwriting, what shows up over and over again, you have orthographic coding problems, and that orthographic loop that involves finger sequencing, planning and sequencing, not just motor output. In dysgraphia, the problem is not basically motor. It's orthographic coding and executive functions for the motor system. Now, are there kids who have developmental disabilities in the motor system, like severe cerebral palsy? You bet. And I worked with that population for a number of years. Will they have handwriting problems? Yes. Is it dysgraphia? No. It's handwriting problems related to their motor profile, related to their cerebral palsy. And the mistake we're making in the schools, when kids have illegible handwriting or they go so slow they can't finish their writing assignment, who do they get referred to? The physical therapist, the OT. No. We need the whole interdisciplinary team, the school psych, the SLP, because there could be other things going on, the classroom teacher, the special ed teacher, and put this all together. Because ultimately, do you know what the cure for dysgraphia is? Appropriate handwriting instruction. And very few PTs are trained in that. They just don't understand that it's language, too. That orthographic, being able to hold letters in the mind's eye, find the letters in alphabetic order, write them down so they're legible, and then you get automatic, goes down below the cortex, so you can devote limited working memory resources to the other parts of composing. Okay, dyslexia. What the research is really showing, it's a word-specific, not just decoding problem, spelling. That's the persisting problem. It's the hardest part to fix in dyslexia. And moreover, I don't know if you've thought about this, but we do most of the oral reading at school in the first 3 grades. Grades 4 and above, most of it is silent reading. And very few of our assessments are assessing silent word reading. That's why I like the Nancy Mather has that test of silent word reading fluency. And moreover, you have to be able to spell. And this has been documented across research groups around the world. It's those spelling problems. And you know, the main cause of not getting that high school diploma is you can't keep up with writing assignments or perform on the writing test. And we're finding that sometimes they have trouble even with computerized writing, which can interfere with the annual test and graduating. So the spelling problem is not trivial. Well, the phenotype profile, it's not just phonological. It can be, but particularly grades 4 and above, orthographic coding, and big Tommy, that phonological loop and orthographic loop. And then you have AL-LD, and they are impaired in their morphological and syntactic coding and their word finding. But there's one more important thing. AL-LD emerges first signs preschool. First birthday, delayed first words, and then putting words together. They qualify for oral language intervention in the preschool years. One of the reasons the dyslexics don't get picked up, they're often very chatty. They're very good at the oral expression. It's very specific to those written words. And so, does research show how to define it? And are all writing problems dysgraphia? Yes. Dysgraphia is a Greek word, means impaired letter writing by hand. No, not all writing problems are dysgraphia. I've already discussed that. That's the learning profile. They have trouble on tests like writing the alphabet from memory or copy a sentence with all the alphabet letters in your fastest handwriting or your best handwriting. This is the DASH test. I highly recommend it. We have a lot of research evidence for it. They often have trouble with written math, and that's the phenotype profile. Now, include the OT. We have shown, as others have, that ADHD is more likely to co-occur with dysgraphia than the other SLDs. But it is not only co-occurring with dysgraphia, but still, OTs and PTs can be very helpful in positioning. You know, the wiggly kids, those, I always forget what they're called, those balls, inflatable balls they can sit on instead of a chair, makes a huge difference. They have valuable input. It's just we can't expect them alone to fix dysgraphia and link it to the composing and spelling part of the curriculum. And yes, and I didn't bring this, but we have lots of research evidence now